Good morning. How many of you have read or heard of the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain? Okay, we've got a few people. All right, excellent. Well, for those who don't know, this book was authored by Betty Edwards. It was originally published in 1979, and this latest edition was published in 1999. And it dispelled this myth that drawing was a talent that you were born with. And it's actually a skill that can be learned. Now, one of these skills is viewing negative space. The idea that you don't draw the object, but you draw the spaces in between the object. And this tricks the brain. It switches the brain from a left mode to from a logical thinking mode to a right brain or a perceptual mode. And the benefit of this is when we're making logical decisions, we make bad perceptual decisions. A great example is this chair. If you look at the chair, you'll see the legs are quite thin. And logically, you think, man, if I sit on that chair, that's not going to support a person. And so logically, would increase the size of those legs, and we'll end up distorting the picture. Now, Betty Edwards describes drawing as a global skill consisting of 5 basic skills. And she describes these skills as perceptual skills, the ability to correctly and efficiently understand what has been seen. I'm Nicholas Henry, and I'd like to welcome to you my talk, Modelling on the Right Side of the Brain, where I'll introduce you to the 5 basic skills of object modelling. We will explore using colour and patterns to help you visualize and communicate and understand domain models. And the 5 basic skills for object modelling are finding objects, identifying collaborations, defining business rules, and assigning services and attributes. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page and in terms of what a domain model is. So we're just going to review the scenario of shipping an order, which would perhaps be in an e-commerce domain. Now, a domain really represents a business process. So let's go through this example. So we have a business request that comes into our domain. In this case, it's to ship an order. An order, which represents a business object, will receive that, and it will go ahead and create a shipment, another business object that it will collaborate with. But we probably want to make sure that order's been paid for before we ship that order. It probably wouldn't make much sense, business sense, right? So we have a business rule that will check that order's actually been paid for. So essentially, a business domain or a domain model is a set of business objects that represent these real-world entities. There are collaborations, there are business rules, and there are services that respond to business requests. Now, a model is simply a representation of something. It could be a mental model, our mental understanding of how a business process works. It might be a graphical notation, a graphical model, such as the notation that I'm using up here. Or it might even be codified in your models directory in your Rails application. Of course, there are other concerns when you're building an application. These things like persisting those business objects to a database, generating HTML or JSON, or even handling that HTTP request that comes into your controller. But these are things that are outside of your domain model. And you can think of the domain model as the heart of your application. So I use this term business services. When a business request comes in, we'll use a business service to respond to that request. Now, there's this word services that you might have heard in the previous talk on domain-driven design, and it's a pattern that Rails developers have adopted over the last couple of years, where we create a service class to encapsulate logic such as sort of sending out an email or finding a user record. And the idea is to kind of thin down the responsibilities of a controller. When I use the term service, I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to this idea of responding to a business request. I'll try to use the term business service to differentiate from this idea of a service class. So why object modeling? Well, it feels like there's a gap between user stories. User stories are great at requirements gathering. They're great for describing business requests from the end user's perspective. But how do we take those requirements and then go ahead and implement that model in our Rails application? It's almost like we're missing a tool. We're missing a tool to represent this underlying business model, a tool to identify the business objects that represent these real-world entities, a tool to define the business rules that govern these collaborations. I think as Rails developers, we kind of lack a language in terms of talking about domains. Normally, we talk about domains in the form of associations and has many and belongs to. Object modeling is a practice, and these 5 basic skills will help us bridge this gap between user stories and implementation. Now, I just want to be clear in terms of setting expectations for this talk. I'm not going to be showing any code. Okay, great, no one got up and left. That's a good sign. And so there's going to be no code examples, and there'll be lots of talks over the next couple of days, showing different implementations. And the thing is, with this practice of object modeling, I believe it's independent of implementation. It just helps you understand the business model itself. Now, this idea of this practice of object modeling, it's not new, and Peter Code first discussed this in his book, Java Modeling in Color with UML. This was first published in 1999. Now, this is not going to be a popular book for Rubyists, right? It has 2 things going wrong with it. It has Java and UML in the title. But there were some other books that were published around the time. Another one's actually Streamlined Object Modeling by Jill Nicola. And this really influenced my thinking in terms of how to understand a business domain. And what I like about object modeling is that it provides us a framework. Very much like Rails provides us a framework in terms of providing us guidance in terms of structuring our application. It provides us conventions, and it helps us accelerate our web development. And object modeling is a little like that. It allows us to discuss, visualize, and help us guide us in terms of implementing those domains. But it also helps us to accelerate our understanding of those business domains. Now, I'm not advocating any big upfront design. This is simply a tool to sketch out those ideas, to collaborate with your team members and help guide your implementation. Sure, the diagrams I'm going to be using today are UML, the Unified Modeling Language. But these are simply communication tools. The goal is not the diagram themselves. Now, as object modelers, our basic building block are objects, which is fantastic, because as Rubyists, we work in an object-oriented language. Now, when I speak about objects, I'm going to speak in the first person, and this helps us personify these objects. So objects have 3 responsibilities: who I know, what I do, and what I know. An example of that, coming back to an order would know a number. It would know its state of its page. It would know a timestamp for when it was purchased at. Of course, it knows other collaborators, so it knows a shipment, and it knows how to ship itself, its business service. So now that we have this building block, let's look at finding objects, our first skill. The problem with finding objects is that often we look at business objects as unique. They're these pretty little snowflakes. But in fact, we can group objects with more or less the same responsibilities of who I know, what I do, and what I know. And these groups are known as archetypes, a term that Peter Code assigned to this. And we have 4 archetypes. We have an event, a role, a party, place, or thing, or a description. Party, place, or thing's a little bit of a mouthful to say every time, so I'll refer to these as the PPTs. So let's look at our first archetype. Our first archetype are events, and these are modeled as transactions within our domain. They're the most important business objects. They're the glue for all the other objects in our business domain. And without an event, I would assert the application is simply a catalog application. So we've got some examples up here. So in the domain of e-commerce, we'd have an order and a shipment. These are transactions within that domain. If we're modeling a hotel reservation system or a car reservation, we'd have a reservation event. And we have two types of events. We have a point in time and an interval. So a point in time has a single timestamp, such as order with the purchased at date. And then we have reservation. We have an interval archetype, illustrated by the reservation here. And this is timestamped or bookend by two timestamps, so the check-in at date and the check-out. Now, roles don't live in isolation. They're the glue in the domain, and other objects interact in this event. And we use roles to represent the way an object participates in this event. So as an example, we have a customer and a sales agent that would interact with an order, and a fulfillment provider that would interact with a shipment. So if we have roles, then we need actors. And the actors in our domain is the PPTs. Now, so a party would be a person or an organization. The place would be such as a thing as a warehouse if we're doing shipment. And everything else is a thing. So again, an example here is the product. And our final archetype is a description. And descriptions are responsible for describing a collection of similar objects, such as our PPTs. An example of this would be a product category that would describe a collection of products, a collection of things, such as T-shirts or a collection of jeans on an e-commerce site. Now, the concept of a description object can be a little tough to kind of grasp sometimes, so I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail when we talk about identifying collaborations. Now, when we're collaborating or presenting a diagram visually, as soon as we have a few business objects on a diagram, it becomes a little tough to navigate. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read all the detail here. I'm just going to illustrate something. But we can solve this issue in terms of navigating these diagrams. And we can add color to give another layer of information. Did anyone notice that the slides changed color when I was talking about the archetypes? Anyone paying notice? Oh, one person. What color was event? Sorry? Yellow? Almost. It was the role. But the event was the pink or the red. And pink's a great color for an event because it highlights this activity in the domain model. It's this hotspot. We will use yellow for roles, the green for the PPTs, and the blue for the description. So we can take a visualization of this in terms of our domain model and add color to that, and you can immediately see this hotspot within your domain model. You can see the events, and you can see the other objects interacting with those events through the yellow roles. Now, more importantly, we have this awesome collaboration tool where we can use post-it notes that correspond to these colored archetypes and a whiteboard. And with our team members, we can collaborate in an agile manner on our business domain. So now we have these four archetypes that helps us guide finding business objects in our domain. But you might have noticed that it was a little difficult for me to talk about one object in isolation. And this leads us to our next skill, identifying collaborations. Before moving on to collaborations, I just want to discuss this idea of associations versus collaborations. As Rails developers, we're very familiar with the idea of associations from ActiveRecord. But associations kind of have this idea of a passive relationship, where collaborations kind of communicates this idea of an active relationship with dialogue. And dialogue becomes very important when we talk about business rules. So I'm going to use the idea of collaborations for the rest of this talk. Now, identifying collaborations addresses this object's responsibility of who I know. Now, often we think about objects in isolation. We think about a customer. We think about an order. But the presence of one business object suggests the presence of another. And this is really highlighted by this, what I've dubbed the elementary collaboration pattern. So let's walk through this. So when we have the presence of an event, we know that there's a role required to interact with that event. And if we have roles, we need an actor, and this is our PPTs. And of course, if we have a collection of PPTs, perhaps we need a description to describe that collection. Now, this is essentially a template, and templates are meant to be modified based on need. An example of this, if you have a PPT that only participates in one event, do not create a dedicated role for that. That's just going to complicate your object model. Here we have an example of a person interacting with an order. So a person can either interact with that as a customer or as a sales agent. So, of course, the customer is the one who's purchasing that order, and the other is perhaps approving that order. Now, we might have a business rule that suggests that the same person cannot be the same person cannot play the roles at the same time, meaning they can't be the customer and the sales agent. There's another notation that I've introduced here in terms of the UML, is that we have multiplicity rules identified. So the one next to the customer on the right-hand side suggests that that an order only belongs to one customer. And a customer can actually belong to many orders, and that's denoted by the 0 and the asterisk next to the order. Now here's our description of the PPTs. A PPT versus a description. I was talking about how descriptions might be a little sort of tough to grasp. I'm just going to go through an example here. Here we have a vehicle that's uniquely identified by a registration number. And we have a vehicle make that describes that vehicle. It describes the model, and it describes the year that model was released. Let's take a little concrete example, and we'll make this a little clearer. So here we have 4 instances of a vehicle. We have 1 and 2, and you'll see that there's a uniquely identified registration number. But we have duplicated data here, duplicated attributes here with the model and year. And this was repeated again in the instances 3 and 4. I've highlighted it here so you can see the repeating data. And we can, of course, extract these in. We'll use a business request term business services when we can extract those repeating attributes. And here the business object with the registration number is our vehicle, and with the model year we have the vehicle make. So the instances of 1 and 2 of the vehicle are described by the first instance of the description, which is the Corolla 2010. And the instances 3 and 4 are described by the second instance of that description, the Focus 2014. So you can sort of think about this in the terms of data normalization. Now, archetypes can collaborate with the same archetype. So a PPT can collaborate with another PPT. In this instance, we're going to look at event collaborations. And there's 2 event collaborations that we'll have a look at. The first one is the composite. The composite is actually made up of other events. So here we have the composite transaction and the line item. The example is the order and the order line item. I've introduced another little bit of UML notation with that the solid diamond, and that denotes the composite within this pattern. Another event collaboration pattern is the follow-up pattern, where we have a transaction and then we have a follow-up transaction. And in this case, we have an order that is followed up by a shipment. Another example of this would be an order followed up by a payment. So let's sort of take a look at this in an example, a larger example. Here we have a product description describing a collection of products. This product is interacting with this order line item. And this is kind of this product interacting with an order line item, the idea of a thing interacting with a line item. That's a common pattern that you'll see in domains. But the interesting thing here is the composite. And the highlighting's not showing up very well. I apologize for that. But the order in the order line item is our composite pattern that we've seen before. But the interesting thing is we repeat this pattern as well. So with a shipment and a shipment line item, that is a composite. And we can repeat this again in terms of the the shipment line item is a follow-up for the order line item. But this is when the magic starts to happen, is when we add another composite with a return and a return line item. Again, and this is a collaboration, a composite collaboration. And we can use these collaboration patterns as a building block in our domains as well. And this moves us on to business rules. So we're talking about these collaborations, but what governs these collaborations? So business rules are either self-authored policies that specify how a business should operate, or these are constraints that are forced upon a business, such as laws determined by a government. Now, often when we think about business rules, we kind of think about validation rules, where we're just validating that an email is present, or if it's in the correct format, such as using a regular expression for that email address. But business rules extend beyond this. They govern or validate collaborations. Now, if business rules govern collaborations, then each partner, that business object, must determine if that collaboration is valid, because each partner may have a different condition to determine if that is a valid collaboration. Here we have an example with a shipment and a shipping method that are looking to collaborate. The shipment has a total weight, and it might be expedited, so we want to get that shipment out quickly. A shipping method has a maximum weight and a duration. So let's look at these two business objects collaborating. Now, a shipping method adds a constraint on its collaboration with a shipment. It will not collaborate with a shipment whose total weight exceeds the maximum weight. Likewise, a shipment adds a constraint on its collaboration with the shipping method. It will not collaborate, if that shipment is expedited, it will not collaborate with a shipment, with a shipping method whose duration exceeds 2 days. So from this example, we've illustrated that each partner must validate the collaboration. And each partner adds a constraint, each partner adds a constraint to that collaboration, owns that business rule. And that business rule is encapsulated in that business object, and it shields that condition from its collaborator. So now that we understand that business rules are simply not validation rules, that they govern these collaborations, when do these collaborations form? And this takes us to our fourth skill of assigning services. And services are related to this responsibility of what I do. Now, business services respond to business requests. They form new collaborations, they dissolve collaborations, and they may even create new event objects. Of course, services can update attributes. However, for this talk, I'm going to focus on collaborations. Now, as a reminder, we'll just revisit the scenario from the beginning of my talk. Here we have a business request coming into our domain, and that's going to be to ship an order. The order is going to respond to that, but it's going to check that business rule to make sure it's been paid. And then it'll go ahead and it will create a new shipment and collaborate with that. So our challenge when we're object modeling is that in the real world, entities are acted upon. Someone ships an order. But when we're object modeling, objects that represent those real-world entities perform the actions themselves. So an order will ship itself. And the reason for that is that all the information inside an object, all the information needed to act on that object is inside of that object. So let that object do the work. Otherwise, we end up creating these dedicated, coordinating objects like Shipment Manager. And an object like Shipment Manager doesn't represent a real-world entity and just adds conceptual noise to our domain model. So with this in mind, we assign this ship service to the order so it can respond to that business request. And the service becomes an object factory for the shipment. And this is and follows the pattern of services becoming object factories for events. And here we come to our last skill in terms of assigning attributes. And we've already taken a look at some attributes. These attributes respond to what I know. So coming back to our vehicle and our vehicle make, a vehicle with this registration number is a descriptive or tracking attribute which is typical of a PPT. With the vehicle make, we have these two descriptive attributes of the model and the year. From our order example, again, for the order, it has this tracking attribute of a number. It knows its state, and it has this timestamp that point-in-time events have. Now, Jill Nicola, in her book Streamline Object Modeling, has identified 6 types of attributes. I won't go through all 6, but you can see some examples on the right-hand side there. I'll focus on 2 attributes, the life cycle state and the operating state. The life cycle state is a one-way state transition. So an order would transition from pending to paid to complete, but it won't revert back to that state. An operating state is a state that switches back and forth between 2 states. So an example here is a product could be active, so active in a catalog. We could switch that off and it wouldn't appear in the catalog anymore. And then we can switch it on. So it switches back and forth. So now that you've been introduced to the 5 basic skills of object modeling, we have a set of skills to bridge this gap between your user stories and your Rails application. You have a framework to explore business domains. So I've simply given you an introduction here. And if this talk has resonated with you, you're probably hungry for more. So I've outlined these 3 steps to help you get you started. First, I've created a dedicated blog post providing some online resources that you can read today, plus links to the books that I talked about in this talk. Secondly, share this with your team members. This idea of object modeling is awesome to use as an individual, but the real power is when you have this common language with your teammates and collaborate with each other. And then the third step is buy some Post-it notes. Post-it notes are an awesome collaboration tool and a simple collaboration tool, and it makes this whole modeling fun. So the next time when a team member asks you, how do I model this? Use archetypes to guide you in finding objects. Use color to visualize and collaborate with your team members. Use the presence of one object to suggest the presence of another and form collaborations. Use business rules to validate or govern these collaborations. Assign services to business objects to fulfill business requests. And use these skills to build a model that mirrors the business, enabling you to correctly and efficiently understand the domain. Thank you.